3 games left in the NFL season, 2 games this weekend. There's a 2-game slate on DraftKings, 2-game slate on FanDuel, and we're going to find a way to find some winners. Let's get after it.
It's Short King Summer, dude. It just feels like no one in fantasy sports ever learns anything. Does he mistime it, or is Brock Bowers just a grown man? Brock Bowers is just a grown man. Dare I say, Rich, football might be back. In the words of Lane Johnson, this offense looks constipated. It's Short King Summer.
No Jacob Sanderson this week as we think about DFS. Didn't think we needed to pull Jacob out of his igloo in Canada to break down this 2-game slate. We'll be able to go through it fairly quickly. I have the solver pulled up here, and we're going to do what we always do, game by game with the DraftKings salaries. I've actually ran the top 150 optimals. Maybe we should start with the optimal rates before we get into Philadelphia and Washington. Right over here in the right-hand corner, you can see the actual exposure to players in the top 150 lineups generated by 50% projection and 50% ceiling. In the settings, I did a very simple stack. I just had it set up max players versus defense, all allowed, and I did at least one wide receiver or tight end with the quarterback in a 2-game slate. That's probably going to naturally occur anyway. 100% of the top 150 lineups by 50% projection, 50% ceiling include Saquon Barkley, 87% with Hollywood Brown, 85% with Worthy, 77% with Kelsey, AJ Brown, 74%. And those are all the skill position players who are over 50%. Then we are down to Eckler at 47%. So let's get into it. The Philadelphia Eagles are at home as 6.5-point favorites against the Washington Commanders. You would definitely not think this thinking about the Commanders and their offense, but they do have the lowest team total of all 4 teams in this slate. Saquon Barkley right now by Establish the Run is projected for 25 DraftKings points with only a 76% ownership projection. Now, if I swap this to small field, I imagine that goes higher. Yeah, 91%. So if you're playing this in the spy, you're playing this in the red zone, you're going to get a good bit more of him. Jaden Daniels projected for 22 points. If you compare that to the other guys at tight end, that actually only makes him, a little bit better than Hurts, a little bit better than Mahomes. Mahomes for 21.2. Jaden Daniels, basically 0.8 points better than that. Again, that would not be how you would necessarily think of those guys, which I think is always important when we are doing these slates, is what is the gap in perception and in projection? Because oftentimes in a 2-game slate, 3-game slate, 4-game slate, you will find particular players who are treated by the field in a way that is not represented in their projection. Like, for example, I can just say right now, if the ownership is close, I actually prefer Jalen Hurts to Jaden Daniels for 2 reasons. The first being the Commanders' defense is far worse. I think that Jaden Daniels is obviously I actually think Jaden Daniels is probably a better quarterback, but his weapons are far worse. One of the input volatility things with Hurts is how injured is his knee going to be. We saw in that game last week, I mean, they were even loath to do the tush push. They waited until literally 4th down to do the tush push for Jalen Hurts in a goal to go situation. They ended up getting the false start, so Hurts didn't get the touchdown. Lane Johnson with the false start. How weird was that? But I think that is going to creep into people's perceptions this week. And the line for this game is indicating that Hurts is healthy. If Hurts was seriously playing injured, I don't think that they would be, I think they'd be more like a 4.5 point, 5.5 point, but it's through that key number they've gotten to be a 6-point favorite. I think that is a pretty big deal. Then we have AJ Brown projected for 16, McLaurin projected for 14. This to me feels like the biggest edge on the slate, basically playing AJ Brown instead of Terry McLaurin. I don't think that this ownership is right. I think you can basically switch this ownership around, particularly in small field stuff. I think that the combined ownership of Jaden Daniels and McLaurin will be higher than the combined ownership of Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown. And look, I know AJ Brown has been brutal in these playoffs. If you drafted him playoff best ball, if you have, got a team through to the semifinals, you're looking at this and you're having a bad time because AJ Brown has not found his inner excellence. In fact, he's tilting over on the sideline. But if we look at the usage in the playoffs, not really going to do better than literally 100% of routes and 27% of the team's targets. They've not been efficient passing the ball, but again, this Commanders defense is fairly weak. I will say, if you are playing DFS this weekend and you're playing in anything that is not a true lottery field, millionaire maker, mini max type things, I think you're just playing Saquon Barkley. He is projected so much better than every other skill position player on the slate. He is projected 9 points better than every other skill position player on the slate. And there are only two players, AJ Brown and Kelsey, who are within 10 points. I think we just call that a lock. And if he gets hurt, if he doesn't score a touchdown, sure, there are many other avenues towards winning. But in this meta of DFS, I just don't think it's valuable enough. I don't think you're gaining enough leverage. I think you're giving up so much in projection. I think you just got to play him. McLaurin, though, I do think is a pretty strong fade. I mean, the Eagles defense far and away number one in the NFL in terms of pass defense. Quinyon Mitchell may or may not be playing. Obviously, that would impact McLaurin's projection a little bit, but probably not a ton, honestly, because the other secondary weapons for the Commanders, I know De'Ami Brown had the good game. He's kind of turned on here at the end of the year, but he's still De'Ami Brown. I think that a lot of the flaws in the Commanders' makeup, we talked about this on some of the playoff stuff, is like the Commanders are just a little too early. They're in that arc. We see this a lot in the NBA. A young team will just like randomly get to the conference finals and they get smoked when they get there. And I wonder if that's kind of the arc that the Commanders are on. Devonta Smith, I actually think at 5,800, he might end up getting a little bit over-owned because he is the more cozy, comfortable click there. Like hand drafters, I think are going to be more likely to click Devonta. Now, if you have the answer to this question, who is the better play between Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson Jr., then man, you are going to be having a pretty good time. My sense is that it is probably Eckler because, again, I think that the most realistic thing here, and we can look at their numbers in the playoffs, their usage in the last 2 weeks, we have obviously seen an increase in targets, a 24% targets per route run for Austin Eckler in the playoffs, a 19% targets per route run, 8% of the team's targets for Brian Robinson. But B-Rob has gotten 75% of the touches inside the 5. We have gotten no touches inside the 5 in the playoffs for Austin Eckler. In fact, Jeremy McNichols cashed in a touchdown last week, so he handled an inside the 5 rush. But again, and this could be, I could be biased, I could be holding on to priors, but I think we're going to see a lot of dropbacks for the Commanders here. I think the Eagles are just too suffocating. I think it'll be kind of similar to what we saw with the Rams last week. The Rams' best success was they kind of abandoned the run. They went to the hurry up. They were challenging those corners in the second half. The ground and pound was not successful, and I don't think that it's going to be successful for the Commanders either. Goddard actually is quite a good leverage play. I think the thing that we will see, obviously, is there's going to be a lot of 2 tight end lineups. I think we're going to see a lot of Kincaid, a lot of Ertz, a lot of Goddard, a lot of Noah Gray. And I think these 2 tight end lineups are pretty strong. I would not avoid them just because they are chalky. I think they're probably pretty good. Maybe you slightly prefer Ertz to Goddard because Olamide Zaccheaus is coming into this game with a groin injury. He got in 1 limited practice. He never got ruled out of last week's game. In fact, with that groin injury, he came back in, but Jamison Crowder was playing ahead of him. But Ertz is just like a very important player inside of the Commanders offense. He has 29% of their end zone targets in the playoffs. He has a 15% targets per route run. He's on the field a ton. And I think you could argue his target projection should probably be better than Goddard. So I actually think Ertz slightly better than Goddard's, particularly at this ownership, 18% to 21%. De'Ami Brown looks like the most over-owned player of the slate to me, which is not to say that you shouldn't play him. But if we look at the optimal rates down here, he's actually in 21% of the actual top optimals while being 29% projected ownership. Same deal for McLaurin. 18% of these top projected lineups, but then 35% projected owned. I think these guys are mostly, they should kind of just be left to like lottery style fields. Like I would not be playing De'Ami Brown in the SPY. I would not be playing Terry McLaurin in the SPY. And maybe you could argue I am underrating the Commanders as a whole. I'm underrating Cliff. I'm underrating Jane Daniels, and I'm open to all of that. And now we get to the punt range here. Zacchaeus, Crowder, Dotson, Gainwell, Bates, Calcaterra. These guys are to me not really playable outside of the lotteries. Crowder, I think, is probably playable in the lottery style fields, actually. I think if I am right, that Olamide Zacchaeus is limited. Last week, he ran 47% of the routes, 12% targets per route run. Crowder got bumped up to 31% of the routes, 18% targets per route run as a result of that injury. That is an input volatility thing that a lot of the field will not be aware of. And if you told me Crowder ran 33% of the routes, or they played a lot less John Bates, I mean, certainly it would be possible that they do play less John Bates, who has played, he's running 38% and 39% of the routes, but maybe they just can't afford, maybe they're chasing the game from the jump here. I think we would see Crowder jump. I mean, certainly he's playing ahead of Luke McCaffrey. Certainly he's playing ahead of Chris Moore. So I think you could maybe get away with playing a little bit of Crowder. Maybe you could even play Crowder in the spy and then just play pure chalk around him. Zacchaeus, I suppose if we get a full practice from Zacchaeus on Thursday or Friday, then you can play him at 3,900, and particularly if he is not all that owned. But I'm not crazy about it. My favorite angle from this game is just to play Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Barkley, and Goddard all together. You do the mega stack. For example, the second highest projected lineup here is Hurts, Barkley, AJ Brown. But if instead of Kincaid, you played Goddard and you went down to a cheaper defense, then you were in a little bit narrower part of the game tree, which I like. Now let's move on to the other game. We have the Buffalo Bills at the Kansas City Chiefs. This game has the Bills with a team total of 23. The Chiefs, a very small 1.5 home favorite, 24.5. The Eagles do have the highest team total of the slate. The Bills, man, they got a lot of psychic baggage to hand off here. Earlier in the year, these two teams played, and there wasn't much fantasy goodness to be had on the Chiefs side. Isaiah Pacheco did not play in that game, and Dalton Kincaid did not play in that game. The projections here have Mahomes as stone chalk, Kelsey as stone chalk. I think that Kelsey is probably just as good of a play at tight end as Barkley is at running back / flex. He is projected so much better than every other tight end. He's projected for 15, Goddard for 8.7, Ertz for 8.6, Kincaid for 7.4. I mean, actually, Noah Gray is closer in projection to Dallas Goedert than Travis Kelce is to Goddard. So I think, in my opinion, again, something we have so learned about DFS in 2024, 2025 is people do not play the best plays nearly enough. And if you're not playing the best plays nearly enough, I mean, I think if I was running 150 this week, which I won't, I'll be playing in the spy, the red zone, and those things, I would lock Kelsey, I would lock Barkley, and I would just try and find weird combinations around that. It's so hard for me to imagine a game where those two guys stay healthy and they're not optimal at their positions. It would take a true crazy set of circumstances. And I think people sort of think about 2 and 3 and 4 game slates in the wrong way. They're like, oh, I need to fade the chalk. It's really more about the combinations of players. So I'd be like, oh, well, Josh Allen and Travis Kelce are going to be paired together way less than Allen or than Mahomes and Kelce are going to be paired. Mahomes is going to be the most owned quarterback of the slate. Allen is projected to only be 16% owned. I mean, that right there, that is a way to start getting very unique. Then we have the Chiefs wide receivers. We have Worthy, Hollywood, and Hopkins, who are all showing up. It was a good bit of fun. Actually, Hopkins not projected to be owned at all, which I think is sort of interesting. To me, it feels like a little bit of an overreaction based on his usage last week. He ran 41% of the routes last week. Juju ran 41% of the routes last week. But if you ask yourself, in a more competitive game, a game where Kansas City could be trailing, what is likely to happen? Well, I think we will see Juju play less. We'll see Hopkins play more. I think the big thing to note, 72% of the routes, which is obviously a season high for Hollywood. He did have the 40-yard air yard ball down the left sideline that he couldn't quite come through in. And then Worthy has really just ascended in the back half of the season. So since week 14, He's run at least 80% of the routes in every game other than week 18. Basically, if you remove week 18, I mean, he's handling about 24% of the targets for Kansas City, about a 25% targets per route run. I mean, he is just such a valuable player and really probably the best wide receiver play of the slate once you start to account for salary. So I'm not looking to get away from him at all. The running backs in this game are maybe more interesting. Isaiah Pacheco is projected to be on 9% of rosters. Hunt is projected to be on 13% of rosters. And this, keep in mind, this is in small field. While meanwhile, because of the safety of James Cook, he's projected to be about 30%. And I think the market kind of has this wrong a little bit because Cook is exactly who he is. He does not play more than 50% of the snaps. He doesn't handle half of the team's rushing attempts. He doesn't handle half of the rushes inside the 5. He just is run so hot. He does not get targeted. 8% of the targets, 17% targets were outrun on the season. You compare that to Kansas City. I mean, Kareem Hunt actually has a better role. Kareem Hunt has about the same role in terms of the passing game. He doesn't play any of the long down and distance. That's all Pirine, but he gets all of the rushes inside the 5. He plays about half the snaps. He gets about half the rushes. Pacheco is just not healthy. I think the Chiefs wanted him to be healthy. I don't think their idea was like, oh, you know what we need to do? We really need to get Kareem Hunt involved in our playoff plans. I don't really think that was ever on the front of the mind for the Kansas City Chiefs. So for me, Kareem Hunt, that's the gold star play. I'm flag planning, putting the lock button on Kareem Hunt. I think he is the best play on the Chiefs. I think that Hollywood is probably a little bit overowned relative to DeAndre Hopkins. And then I'll tell you what I think will probably decide the slate. Who is going to win the $1 million? Who is going to figure it out? It is going to be, outside of Khalil Shakir, what direction do the Buffalo Bills go in? Cooper's role has been steadily reduced since week 14. His targets per route run is very high, but his route share and his target share in this sample, he's below 50% of the routes, below 14% of the targets. Keon Coleman has seen huge target spikes in week 15 and in week 17. Did not play much, was not targeted much, but that was a clear win for them. They were so run heavy against the Ravens that he didn't really have, there was just no need really for him. We've seen Mac Hollins basically start to play more. And then how about the random target spikes for Curtis Samuel? 19% and 20% targets per route run. I actually, in this slate, I'm going to be pushing my chips in on Keon Coleman and Curtis Samuel. I'll probably play some Cooper because Cooper is going to be so unpopular. Our friends over at ETR and the Solver have him for 0.3% owned on this slate. I mean, it's just unbelievable. That's Amari Cooper. And the thing about Cooper is actually very similar to Coleman. He could certainly get there on one target. I mean, Amari Cooper could have a 60-yard touchdown against the Chiefs. I don't think it's likely, but certainly it's possible. I'm not ruling it out. I think mixing and matching Bills wide receivers, I would say, is probably your ideal way to win this slate. If you're playing 5 lineups, maybe literally if you're playing 5 lineups, play, one Shakir, one Coleman, one Cooper, one Hollins, one Samuel. Maybe that is the easiest way to go about it. But I think mixing and matching there is quite strong. My favorite is going to be Keon Coleman at 3,700. In terms of peripheral Chiefs players, Noah Gray he just has not had to do anything. I mean, when is the last time the Kansas City Chiefs play? I guess the last time the Chiefs played a competitive game that they really needed to win was against the Texans, and Noah Gray didn't do anything in that game. But the games before that, 22% targets per route run, 24% targets per route run, 25% targets per route run. On the season, only 9% of the team's targets, but 15% targets per route run. I think Noah Gray is probably a legitimate sleeper. And then the biggest thing is that he has 14% of the team's end zone targets. That's not even that much lower than Kelsey. Kelsey has 22% of the team's end zone targets, and Noah Gray is targeted so often on play action. 43% of his targets come on play action. So I think he's pretty strong. Now, let's go ahead, as we always do, and we will build a lineup. I'm going to take Jalen Hurts at quarterback. I'm going to take Saquon Barkley at running back. I might do a double running back one on this one because I do think Eckler, Eckler that much more owned than Kareem Hunt. It really is just wrong. By the way, I didn't talk about Ty Johnson or Samaje Perine at all. I think they're both fine. I think they're lottery fields only. They need a touchdown to get there, and their competition is almost more the tight ends than it is the running backs. It's almost like Ty Johnson needs to outscore Dalton Kincaid, who again, I suppose I should have mentioned. Kincaid is 7th amongst NFL tight ends in targets per run and 17th in points. It's just not a very efficient player. We are going to play AJ Brown. We are going to play, this is the thing we're going to do to get weird. We are going to do Curtis Samuel as our targets per route run guy on this lineup. We're going to put Kelsey in at tight end. That leaves us 4,400 remaining per player. Let's see what happens when we do the Chiefs defense, which, by the way, the Chiefs defense, 12% owned. They are a very good defense. I know Josh Allen never takes sacks. He never turns the ball over, but I think that ownership discrepancy between the Chiefs and the Eagles is a bit out of whack. We probably need a Chiefs wide receiver. I wonder how this lineup would sim. We have a lot. I guess we saved a lot of ownership with Samuel. We saved a lot of ownership with Kareem Hunt, 13% ownership on Hunt. That is going to be low on Samuel. That's his small field ownership. What his large field ownership, that feels more right to me, about 1%. Let's throw Worthy in there and see where we are at salary-wise. We now have 4,600 remaining, so we could play Hollywood, but Goddard feels a little bit better when we already have. Actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do Ertz, and then we can actually play the Eagles defense if we want. Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, Kareem Hunt, AJ Brown, Curtis Samuel, Xavier Worthy, Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, and the Eagles defense. Flag plants, very simple. Kareem Hunt, plant the flag. Put the gold star next to Kareem Hunt in your lineups. And then I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to say one of the non-Shakir Bills wide receivers also makes it in the optimal. My favorite is Keon Coleman. Could be Curtis Samuel, could be Amari Cooper, could be Mac Hollins, but I think those guys are all a little bit underowned. That is going to do it for our conference championship NFL DFS preview. Please, please, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. Consider becoming a member to the channel. We've been doing members only videos on the channel. You can join the Discord. You can hang out with us all the time. I would really appreciate that if you liked, subscribed, or became a member. All of those would be fantastic. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck this weekend.
It's Short King Summer, dude. It just feels like no one in fantasy sports ever learns anything. Does he mistime it, or is Brock Bowers just a grown man? Brock Bowers is just a grown man. Dare I say, Rich, football might be back. In the words of Lane Johnson, this offense looks constipated. It's Short